and again. Now, I hope they have moved on to the rest of the book, but I think what they discovered there was enough of a hook that they could identify with the experience that the women that I spoke to over this extended period of time went through, and I hope you will too. So I'm going to take just a few minutes. The preface is short, so I will read that, and then I'll let Emma ask some, I'm sure, great questions. So I'll begin. And apologies, I'm not the reader of the audio book for good reason, as you will find out. But here we go. Especially for women, Donald J. Trump's 2016 election came as a bolt out of the blue, a jolt that left them personally wounded, fearful, and angry. They had expected so much better from the American electorate. Demagogues had run for president before, but had been kept at bay. Huey Long, George Wallace, and Father Coughlin never came close to winning national elections. Nevertheless, tens of millions of voters had embraced an abjectly ignorant, racist, and unfit huckster. His negative attributes had not disqualified him in their eyes, but rather they endeared him to them. His election unnerved the daughters of the 1960s and 1970s, who had seen uneven but forward progress for women on so many fronts. The election of a man nostalgic for the unliberated 1950s undermined their faith in their fellow Americans' judgment and tolerance. The assumption that one could rely on the common sense of the American people now seemed farcical. Past gains women had once imagined permanent, such as access to safe abortions, seemed suddenly fragile. Women's confidence that legal, social, and economic advances provided a floor below which American women could not fall was called into question. The promise that women were on a path to full inclusion and equal power in all respects of American life, that suddenly seemed like a pipe dream. In the face of this calamity, women did what they always did. They gathered to talk and commiserate, to bolster one another, to share their stories, and to begin planning. With remarkable speed, a grassroots resistance, not made up exclusively, but certainly primarily of women, began to sprout. When the shock of election night wore off, millions of women faced daunting challenges to actively engage as citizens, to elevate women's place in American politics, to continue to fight against Trump's policies, and to decry his outrageous scandals and lies. Women exasperated by Trump's election ran for office by the hundreds. Others volunteered, raised money, or protested. In whatever role they played over the next 4 years, volunteer, activist, candidate, donor, protester, women refused to allow Trump's presidency to become the new normal. At the same time the grassroots opposition was sprouting, key women power players in the Democratic Party started to pick up the pieces after a devastating loss, infuse their organizations with new purpose, harness the energy from the grassroots, and deploy their fundraising dollars and expertise to dislodge Trump. They channeled women's anger over the confirmation of Justice Brett Kavanaugh in 2018. Their outrage over Southern states' abortion bans, their horror over the grotesque mistreatment of migrant families and children, their indignation over the constant assaults on democracy, and their grief over the passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 2020 into a defiant movement to deny Trump a second term. Meanwhile, in some corners of the Republican Party, lifelong conservatives were mortified that the party of Abraham Lincoln had united behind someone whose characters and views represented a repudiation of everything that had attracted them to the GOP. To the shock of anti-Trump Republicans, fellow members who had once extolled the GOP as the party of ideas countenanced Donald Trump's hostile takeover of the party, and worse, began to rationalize and defend his noxious views. Many craved access to the Trump administration and sought jobs in the executive branch, led by a dangerous narcissist. While the Republican Party devolved into a cult of personality, millions of women, both Democrats and Republicans, aghast at the 2016 election results, set out on a personal and political journey that began even before the Women's March on January 21, 2017, the largest single day of protest in American history. Democratic women not only ran, but triumphed in 2018 midterm races. Republican women did the same in 2020. Women candidates joined the presidential race, battling persistent media bias and gender stereotypes, and confronted many less qualified men on the debate stages. Hillary Clinton had not been the last woman to compete for the presidency, but the first for a major political party. Her losing candidacy benefited the more politically adept and diverse women who followed her and enabled the election of a barrier-breaking woman as vice president in 2020. The Trump era was a time of personal triumph and political awakening for many women, and the birth of a mass movement largely headed and fueled by women. It scrambled many women's assumptions about, on both ends of the political spectrum, forged new friendships and encouraged the formation of new networks. Women reinvigorated the Democratic Party and threw the Republican Party back on its heels. The political storm that gained steam over 4 years proved as powerful as the women's movement of the 1970s and as consequential as the 1960s civil rights movement. Trump's shocking victory provoked millions of women to elevate the importance of politics in their daily lives to the extreme detriment of the party Trump took over. Women's political involvement soared and their partisan identification shifted in dramatic ways, affecting the composition of Congress, the makeup of parties, and the language of politics. Ironically, Trump prompted many white women to prioritize gender over race. His election added impetus to political organizing among Black women, along the backbone of the Democratic Party, and among Native Americans. In the aftermath of Trump's defeat, we can now fully appreciate how millions of women transformed their lives and recaptured our democracy from the clutches of an authoritarian bully. Defeat is an orphan, the saying goes, but victory in this case had millions of mothers. Their story is what follows.
Thank you, Jennifer. I am so glad to be here. Jennifer and I are colleagues at the Washington Post, but it is a big place and we work on in very different parts of it, with Jennifer in opinion and me on the news side. So we don't know each other, and I'm just so delighted to be here to have a chance to talk with you, Jennifer, about your new book. And thanks to all of you who are here listening. We will definitely have time for questions towards the end of the hour. So there is a Q&A box there, and I hope you'll drop your questions there throughout so that we can put them to Jennifer when the time comes. So I'm going to start, Jennifer, by asking, you wrote in the book about how not only did politics change dramatically during the Trump era, but women, and in politics, as politics was shifting, women were contributing so much to what was happening, but you wrote about how women themselves sort of changed in this time, right? And I'm wondering for you, in your decision to write this book, if you could talk about your sort of the evolution of your political identity, how much of that was the Republican Party changing, and how much of that was your own, views changing over time?
Well, it is certainly true that women changed. Many of the women who I write about on the Democratic side had never been involved in politics. They had voted, but they were in their daily lives essentially apolitical. Or as Katie Porter, the representative from Orange County, the Democratic woman, pointed out, they were being political, but they didn't know it. In other words, they were involved in causes that public policy and politics directly implicated, but they themselves didn't think of themselves as joining elections, as running for office, or as campaigning or volunteering. But that changed because women, I think, were fundamentally shaken in a way that men were not by the election of Donald Trump. And for Republican women, and I had always identified in the Republican Party, it was just a stunning blow. I broke up with the Republican Party in the spring of 2016 because I believed that a party that could accept Donald Trump as its nominee could not be one that I could be a part of. But I think, like many women, I really never imagined he would get elected. And I thought at the end of this, the Republican Party would be dealt a blow. They would never do this again, and they would sort of reformulate themselves and come up with a responsible governing philosophy going forward. That, of course, did not happen. As it became clear that they would not happen, not only did I remain firmly outside the party, but many other conservative women did too. And I speak in the book about many women who have now become household names as former Republicans who are now involved in some aspect of politics in confronting not only Trump, but this anti-democratic, pro-authoritarian movement. I talk about Sarah Longwell, who was for many years a Republican consultant, and people now may know that she writes for an outlet called The Bulwark, or The Bulwark rather, which is solely comprised of people who used to be Republicans. She runs these phenomenal focus groups and is able to kind of explain to the rest of us what it is women are thinking, what women who voted for Trump or didn't vote for Trump are thinking. So all of these people went through a metamorphosis and really almost a life change. When you think about yourself, if you've made your career in some aspect of politics and you've always identified with one political party, your network of people, your way of perceiving the world, your views on a whole range of issues, including how the press covers the parties, is shaped in a certain way. And to break clear of that, on one hand, is liberating, but it's also very disorienting. And I'm not merely talking about my former Republican colleagues who write hate mail and are very, very upset that some of us have left the party, but simply because both as a reporter and as a person, I didn't have the extensive relationships on the Democratic side that I did on the conservative side. So in some sense, it was remaking my affiliations, remaking my perspective. People ask me, am I still a conservative, even if I'm not a Republican? And the way I answer that is conservative has lost all possible meaning. You can't be a conservative and believe in riots. You can't be a conservative and not believe in the American creed, all men were created equal. You can't be a conservative and seek radical overthrow of democratic norms and institutions. So there is nothing conservative at all about the Republican Party. And what we have right now is a reactionary right-wing party and a center-left Democratic Party. And the center-left party, although I have policy differences with many of them, I identify entirely with what I consider to be my highest priority, and that is the preservation of democracy, the reestablishment of democratic norms, the reaffirmation that elections aren't just a suggestion, they are inviolate and they are the final word on how we elect our leaders. So I think there are a great number of people on both sides of the aisle who have kind of come together in a pro-democracy coalition, if you will, to try to elevate these issues, to make sure they are front and center, and that the lessons of the last few years are not lost, and that we make strides in putting up guardrails and insulating the system so that we don't have a repeat of the last 4 years and don't have a repeat of January 6th. So in that regard, the book has turned out to be a lot more relevant than I imagined it would be post-Trump than it was during the Trump presidency.
Well, I have a bunch of questions for you about women's roles in politics post-January 6th, but I want to ask you actually about Sarah Longwell. She was, to me, one of the most compelling people that you wrote about in the book. And she, in her focus groups, I thought this was really interesting. She observed that the definition of pro-life seemed to change for Republican women over the course of the 4 years that Trump was in office. I think in part because of George Floyd's killing, in part perhaps because of COVID. Maybe can you explain what you think that is about, or what you know from her work, what that's about, and whether you believe that's going to have lasting impact. The abortion debate continues to rage in this country and is, highlighted by the Texas recent Texas law. And so, is this a meaningful shift among Republican women, do you think?
Well, we should clarify that Sarah talks to people who she considers to be soft Trump voters. These were people who didn't vote for Trump in 2016, or they voted for him and then regretted it. And she has continued to follow them. Some of those people voted for him again in 2020, despite their qualms. Some of them voted for Joe Biden. Some of them voted for, a write-in candidate of their choosing. And so they are a barometer of a still reachable segment of the Republican Party, or at least women who had identified or have identified as Republican, who either have, if you will, seen the light in terms of the threat that Donald Trump poses, or at least are amenable to having that conversation, to considering that. And I think what they experienced beginning in 2019, exactly as you said, they had these abortion bans that were passed not only in the South, but throughout the country, Ohio, Missouri, and other places. And you had the murder of George Floyd. And I think many of them did begin to think, what does it mean to have a culture of life? What does it mean to be respectful of humanity? And I think for some of them, they gained a wider definition, so that even if they were opposed to abortion, what they saw was you can't be indifferent to the fate of African Americans who are abused by police and consider yourself to be pro-life. You can't be indifferent to wearing masks and now getting vaccinated and consider yourself to be pro-life. Now, this is not all Republican women, not all pro-life women, but I think some of it did. And it is a helpful frame, I think, for thinking about the values that a presidency has. And that is entirely relevant now, fast forward to Texas, when you see two completely anomalous phenomenon, if we're talking about life. On one hand, the governor has tried to prohibit mask and vaccine mandates, which save life. And the absence of those mandates, the absence of those requirements is leading to the deaths of people, including the deaths of children. And on the other hand, they have passed this so-called bounty law, where for $10,000, you can turn in a woman who you suspect of having had an abortion more than 6 weeks after her last period, which is before many women know that they're pregnant at all. And anyone can bring one of these suits. In fact, someone who doesn't even live in the state of Texas has brought one of them. And this, as you might imagine, can lead to a parade of horribles: snooping, spying, violation of privacy, an ex-boyfriend using this as leverage, a spouse in a custody fight using the threat of turning her in to win custody of the kids. There's a whole panoply of horrors. And I think this has underscored the notion that the abortion fight is as much about control and women's ability to make their own decisions, own life decisions, as it is about life. Because if we're talking about life, we certainly are talking about people who are still dying from COVID. So I think it will be interesting to see from Sarah as time goes on, whether that wider view of what it means to be pro-life continues, or whether it narrows again to simply be a yes or no question on whether Roe v. Wade should continue to be the law of the land.
Oh yeah, I'm very interested in what she finds on that front. One thing I appreciate in your book is you do not write about women as a monolith, but you sort of repeatedly remind readers that women vote very differently depending on the demographic, depending on demographic groups, so that Black women were really critical in Democrats' efforts to win the Senate and defeat Trump, and turned out in just overwhelming numbers for Democrats. Whereas white women, and particularly white evangelical women, the majority of them still voted for Trump in both races, right? So I wonder, I also thought, as you were bringing to my attention such a range of women who were resisting Trump, I thought about the high profile women or women whose profile has risen, I guess, in defending Trump. And I'm thinking of Sidney Powell and Jenna Ellis and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert. And so I wonder if you can talk about, what you learned in reporting this book about the rise of women across the political spectrum over these years, and whether you think women have been more important to advancing the Democratic agenda versus the Republican agenda, and why.
Well, I think the biggest lesson that I learned is people are not one-dimensional. There are many things that influence how they look at the world and how they go through the world. They are women, but they also have a gender identity. They also have a racial identity. They also have a religious perspective. They also have an education level. They also have a geographic home. And each of these cross cuts against other factors, so that if you look, for example, as you mentioned, at Black women or Latina women, and that issue has been really ignored because Trump did better overall with Latino voters, but with Latinas, Biden did better than Hillary. So when you get down into the subgroups of women, you can really see the diversity. Trump continued to do very well with white, non-college educated women. And people say, why? How can that be? And the answer is many of those are evangelical. Many of them consume the same right-wing media that their male counterparts consume. Many of them have racial or ethnic concerns about the demography of America. That line appeals to them. So there are many factors that go into their vote. It is also true, however, that women migrate over time. It wasn't too long ago that white college-educated women were a very important part of the Republican Party. I write about this, that these were the people who volunteered for the women's Republican campaigns. These were the women who worked at the polls. These were the women who volunteered, who represented the Republican Party in community groups like the League of Women Voters or other nonpartisan groups. And that has certainly been a progress over time, which Donald Trump supercharged. And so that you had Biden winning among white college-educated viewers by a larger margin than Hillary did, which may seem peculiar given the fact she was a white college-educated woman. But it shows how Trump has further alienated at least a certain set of women. It's also significant when we look at, for example, suburban women. People use that term, and I think in their mind's eye, they have an image of a white suburban woman, and that's not accurate. And in this election, it was incredibly important because the areas, for example, in the Philadelphia suburbs, the areas in the Atlanta suburbs were quite diverse. And for example, the Asian American vote essentially doubled, and the large majority of those, women and men, voted for Biden. Likewise, in Arizona, there was a huge organizing drive and turnout among Native American women. As we know, that race was relatively close. And if you want to reduce it all to that, that was more than enough of the margin of victory. So I think it really is important to look at all of the factors that contribute to women's outlook. And I think it's also a lesson for the women and the men who are pursuing this defense of democracy. And that is that you have to meet women where they are, and you have to be able to appeal to them on a higher plane of protection of democracy than on simply a policy level where they may still disagree very vehemently with you. And so I think it's a lesson in making sure that there is not a singular message, a singular tone, a singular pitch to women who are complicated people and who have a whole variety of interests.
You know, you wrote Abigail Spanberger, the centrist Democrat from Virginia. You spoke to her, and she said that she had noticed that, and I think you alluded to this before, that women had started to see themselves and their activities in this time as political when they hadn't seen that before.
Right.
And you wrote, owning their political identity and focusing on their obligations to fellow Americans have made them active citizens, the frontline defenders of democracy. Politics was no longer something other people did. When I read this, I immediately wondered, is that a permanent change, or was that something that came and went? Because I think, COVID has exhausted many women. The energy that women have left over at the end of the day is often not very much, right? Just from sort of getting through. And I wonder, you argue that Trump's election really galvanized a lot of women. And I wonder if Biden's election perhaps became a moment for women who were galvanized by Trump's election to relax. So what do you think is happening with the energy of women activists and politicians and movement leaders now?
Well, certainly there were a group of women in 2018, primarily Democratic, and then women Republicans in 2020 who did very well, who became candidates for the first time, motivated by the Trump reaction or the reaction to the Trump reaction. And those people have now become politicians. They are in office, or if they fail, they're considering running again. And those people, I don't think, are going anywhere. And I spent quite a bit of time talking about this group of 5 Democratic women elected in 2018 who have adopted the moniker of the 5 badasses. These are women who had a national security background or a military background per se. So you have people like Elaine Luria, also from Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, who was in the CIA, Mikey Sherrill, who was in the Navy, Elaine Luria. So there's a whole range of these women who were moderate, who had an ethic of public service, who either were leaving or thinking of leaving the military. And they said, my country needs me. I need to serve in some other way. And this is what they found. So I think women like that are certainly going to continue on in their political careers. And in fact, it was fascinating to me to talk to Nancy Pelosi about how she has assisted these women in launching their careers. She made a number of them as subcommittee chairmen, which is very unusual for a freshman class. In 1992, the so-called Year of the Women, not a single woman was made a subcommittee chairperson. And that is not Nancy Pelosi's style. She's going to give them visibility. She's also going to put them on national security committees, which help a woman's resume with future office. But as you point out, the real question is going to be what people who have other careers, who had to then homeschool their kids during the pandemic, who had 25-hour days, it seemed like, whether they go back to an active political role. And I think it depends on 2 things. One, I think it depends on Republican overreach. And the Republicans tend to be the Democrats' best friend in this regard, because they not only passed a Texas abortion ban, they passed this bizarre bounty bill, which seems grossly, unfair and harassment and invasion of privacy. So it is issues like that that motivate women to stay involved and to keep involved. And I think the other is whether women will continue to recognize that democracy itself is still at issue, that January 6th is not a singular event. It is an ongoing process of trying to delegitimize elections and trying to plant it in people's minds that if you didn't win the election, don't worry, you could still win office. And I think women have got to recognize that that remains an ongoing fight if they're going to remain engaged and you're going to see the kind of turnout and participation. I will say that one of the things that continued to engage women at various times during the Trump years was the immigration issue. the sight of separation at the border of little children and mothers, there was nothing that more infuriated women voters. And the polling shows that there was a significant gap. Men didn't like it either, but women really didn't like it. And the question is now that you have a Democrat in the White House who has had tremendous difficulty dealing with border issues and has been criticized heavily for treatment of the Haitians, for treatment of other immigrants at the border, whether that becomes a turnoff for those same women. Are those women who were outraged at the way people were treated, children, mothers were treated, are those people now going to sit home, sit on their hands because they're not very pleased with what the current president is doing? So it's issues like that that I think Democrats are going to have to think about, women are going to have to think about. And I think whenever the Republican Party does things like refusing to set up a bipartisan January 6th commission, or it's indulging these so-called fraudits, the fake audits, that is a reminder for women and men that democracy remains at risk. It is very hard, however, to get people to maintain that level of tenacity and concern, particularly when their own party, in this case, or the party that was opposing Donald Trump, maybe they're not Democrats yet, is in power rather than Trump. He's not there on your screen, at least not as often as he used to be, to infuriate you and annoy you. And as a result, memories fade. And there is also, I think, the concern among Democrats that Republicans who are following Donald Trump may not seem as scary as Donald Trump. Someone like a Kevin McCarthy may have Donald Trump's interests in mind, but he doesn't seem quite as scary, quite as unhinged. And putting a nicer face on Donald Trump is a problem for those who oppose his movement, because, of course, he would still agree with many of the anti-democratic principles that Trump advanced. So it is a big challenge for Democrats, independents, Republican pro-democracy voters going forward to maintain that kind of intensity and to carry that over, even when Donald Trump technically isn't on the ballot, although he may be sort of looming in the background. And it's fascinating to see that both in the recall of Governor Newsom in California and in the current governor's race in Virginia, that the Democrats are in essence running against Trump and Trumpism. They point to Governor DeSantis, they point to Governor Abbott, and they say, do you want that? And that is in essence a Trump clone. And so it'll be very interesting to see if Democrats running for Senate, running for governor, running for state office are able to nevertheless run against Trump, even if he's not on the ballot.
Well, staying with current, sort of thinking about current events for a moment, you wrote after Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed that the right's notion that conservatives would now control the court for a generation was overly ambitious. And you made reference to the aging justices who were nominated by Republicans and said, no one's immortal, right? And you wrote, whatever temporary victory Trump and McConnell might secure on the court would be of little use if Republicans lost the White House and the Senate for the foreseeable future. And I just wonder how you think now in this moment, given the recent decision on the text to allow the Texas law to take hold, Breyer's determination not to retire, the razor thin margin that Democrats hold in the Senate. Do you still think that this is true, that this Democrats' concern about the court is overblown?
Two ways of looking at this. One is to remember that the Supreme Court gets very important cases, but they get a fraction of the cases. And you'll notice that Biden is making quick work of appointing lower court judges, both at the intermediate level and Court of Appeal justices and district court judges. And those are important because the majority of cases just get decided there. And he has been appointing very diverse candidates, not only in terms of gender and ethnicity, but in terms of background, prosecutors used to dominate the courts, and now he's putting a lot of people who have had defense experiences, criminal defense lawyers, people with a whole range of background. So I think one way to address the issue, if you're concerned about democracy and their survival of a Supreme Court that has credibility, is that you have to also focus, particularly more so than ever, on these lower courts and also on state courts, which, as we know, take a number of important issues. I think the difficulty in the Supreme Court may have an adverse consequence in this sense. I think the notion of having a Supreme Court in which people do not have lifetime tenure is really going to catch on. It has to some extent. And there is a commission right now that Biden has set up to reform the Supreme Court. And I think that is going to become a very significant push for Democrats. I think the thinking is that it'll take a long time otherwise as justices die off or retire. And moreover, simply adding justices may be a bridge too far for a lot of Americans. They don't like the notion of court packing, but it may be much more easy for voters and desirable for voters to say, you know, these justices have started acting like partisan gladiators. Why should they have lifetime tenure, at least on the Supreme Court? Why shouldn't they have 12-year terms, 18-year terms? And although you get appointed to the bench for life in the federal system, there's nothing that says that you have to remain on the Supreme Court for life. And I think you're going to see quite a push to begin to limit that. And that is a warning signal, I think, to the current justices who may be very eager on the conservative side to make very extreme rulings to reverse years of precedent. They need to be concerned about a political backlash, which puts at issue lifetime tenure for the Supreme Court. And you've now seen a whole parade of them out there. And this is sort of like the Nixon, I am not a crook. Amy Coney Barrett saying, I am not a partisan hack. And I think if you have to say that, you have a problem. And I think the American people increasingly, with good reason, view the court as not acting in a judicial capacity, but acting in a ideological policy respect, not necessarily a party, but nevertheless reaching outcomes that are very desirable amongst the presidents that appointed them. So I think that's going to remain an issue very much in play. A lot of discussion recently about Justice Breyer, who comes from the liberal side of the court, is a concern that, oh my gosh, things could get even worse, because if he were to die in office when there is not a Democratic president and a Democratic majority in the Senate, this would be just like Ruth Bader Ginsburg all over again. The Republicans would jam through a conservative justice, and then the balance would be even more in their favor. So you see many Democrats trying to nudge Justice Breyer to hang it up so long as there is a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate. So I think these issues are quite important. And I think this is where public protest and public sentiment does play a part with justices. I think those justices, like the Chief Justice Roberts, who care very much about the intellectual integrity, the institutional integrity of the court, look at polling that shows approval of the Supreme Court has dropped about 20 points in a relatively recent period of time, and they begin to worry, and they will attempt to, I think, implore their colleagues to take a more incremental approach, even if they disagree on the outcomes, for fear that they will trigger a tremendous political backlash. And I think that dynamic between public opinion and maybe not the outcome of cases, but the magnitude of cases, the boldness of cases, is something definitely to keep an eye out on for the next few years.
I have a bunch more questions for you, but I don't want to hog you. So I'm going to bring in some audience questions. And one is related to what the question I asked you about women being tired. This person asks, what's your best advice for women's rights activists who feel burnt out and fatigued from constantly fighting for basic freedoms?
Right. I think read the book is to be number one step. And number two is do what you did before, which is find other women. Women really do operate on relationships. And if you think, well, I'm too tired, if you get a group of your friends, your colleagues to say, we're going to go do something once a week, we're going to do something on a campaign, then I think the multiplier effect and the enthusiasm effect may keep people going. I think it's also incredibly important to keep an eye on what your elected officials are doing. I saw this again and again as I was talking to particularly the women who ran in 2018. They would go to a town hall, and Amy Spanberger describes going to a town hall that David Bratt was holding. David Bratt was the extremely conservative congressman who actually dislodged Eric Cantor from that seat, who at the time was the majority leader. And she sat there, she's a former CIA agent, listening to this guy thinking, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I could do better. This guy doesn't know what he's saying. And I think the scales fell from a lot of women's eyes when they lost the, if you will, the illusion that these people were super competent, super conscientious, super knowledgeable. A lot of them aren't. And a lot of women have all the skills, all the background that they need to run for office as well. And I think 2018, 2020, women showed first-time candidates can win. And they can speak to not only Democrats, but independents and alienated Republicans in a very plain-spoken, very direct way. And they talk about practical things. They talk about kitchen table issues that appeal to a lot of voters. And they offer the promise of a more functional Washington, which many people of both political parties have become alarmed about. So I think what I would say is stay in touch with other women who are involved, bird dog your own representatives, Senate, Congress, governor. Absolutely turn out to vote in midterm elections as well as every 4 years. Volunteer on campaigns. If you are able, give money or help people raise money on campaigns. And this makes a difference. You're creating a whole new infrastructure of women and to some degree men who are prioritizing certain issues, including democracy. And that's important. Even if those candidates don't ultimately win, they've now created a donor base, a volunteer base of newly involved people. So I would hardly recommend all of the above. And of course, you have to support particularly local good journalism, because that's where you're going to find out a lot about what's actually happening in your state, in your city, in your county.
Another question from an audience member is about the 2024 presidential race for the Democrats. And they'd like your thoughts on the fact that it seems like Kamala Harris has disappeared and Biden and Sanders are aging out. Does that leave Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar as the top contenders?
Well, for starters, we haven't determined that Joe Biden isn't going to run. You know, I think there is certainly the drumbeat of the Republicans trying to have us believe that he's already senile, already gone around the bend and couldn't possibly run. We'll have to see whether he feels that he still wants to, that continues to be in good health, and that he thinks he can do it again. We just had Chuck Grassley, the Republican senator from Iowa, who's 88 years old, announce that he's going to run for election again. So, you know, maybe 90 is the new 70. So people do run later and later in life. And the fact that, as you point out, you know, one of the alternatives would be Warren, who is, I can't remember, 69 or 70 already, just shows you how our age frame has shifted. What if he doesn't run? Democrats have traditionally given it to the vice president. It's really hard to deny the next shot to the sitting vice president. You had that, for example, with Walter Mondale. You had it with Al Gore. There is a sense that those people have kind of paid their dues and they need to get it. But I will say, I think there is concern about if Biden can't win, who can reassemble that same coalition of working class whites, college educated people, people of color, a geographic map that includes red states, previously red states. And I think there is concern in the party about whether Harris can do that or not. I think she is a living embodiment of the adage that being vice president is an almost impossible job because you cannot upstage the president. You get assigned all sorts of impossible, unwinnable tasks. You have to remain strictly loyal, so you look like you're a bobblehead at some of these events, simply confirming what the president said. So it's a very difficult position, and I think made more difficult by the fact that she is a woman of color. And I think some of the criticism of her and her staff is influenced by that. So what would happen in 2024 if Biden doesn't win? I think there will be a primary. And we've always had primaries, even if the vice president has originally got it. If you remember, Al Gore had a primary with Bill Bradley for the 2000 race. So you will have other candidates, I think, who come forward. I think you'll see Pete Buttigieg, who has done a really remarkable job keeping his profile as transportation secretary really high in the public mind. I don't remember a secretary of transportation who has become, such a household word. And of course, he and his husband just adopted children, so they're kind of creating this idyllic young American family image. I think Amy Klobuchar, who ran a very strong race and has many of the Biden-like qualities that are possible. It's interesting, her main issue in 2020 was that the African-American community didn't really know her, didn't really like her, didn't necessarily trust her. She is now front and center in the voting rights fight. And if she were to pull a rabbit out of a hat there, she might get a lot of credit and have her credibility rise among those voters. So I think you can look back to the candidates who made a go of it in 2020 and think that many of them will run again. I think you can look at governors like Whitmer in Michigan, who's had a very prominent role. And I think there will be people who come to the fore. I think the Republicans have an interesting problem, the different problem, which is the ghost of Donald Trump freezing the money, freezing the race. And I think until the day before the primaries, perhaps, he's going to keep out the illusion that he is running for office. And that does pose a problem for ambitious Republicans who would like to run. No one wants to run against Donald Trump in the Republican Party. So it really is going to be fascinating going forward. As every vice president experiences, if her boss is viewed as an unsuccessful president, her career is essentially over. So her big priority is not only maintaining her visibility, maintaining her image, but making sure this president is successful.
Well, speaking of money and fundraising for races, what are your thoughts on the difference between elite level fundraising? This is another question from the audience, between male and female candidates. Is there some kind of ceiling or cap for women?
Well, it's a really interesting question. Traditionally, men have overwhelmingly been the donors. In part, when you think about it, if you're going to be a bundler, meaning you're going to put lots of rich people together, all donating at the limit, where do you do that? You're a CEO of a company. You're the named partner of a big law firm. You are in these positions of uber power and wealth, and there are more men who are billionaires and millionaires than there are women. So men have always had kind of the big dollar track in terms of donors. That has begun to change over time. And one of the things we saw through Emily's list and through other women's organizations is a real increase in the number of not only big women donors, big givers and bundlers, but ordinary people. And I do think that the internet and online fundraising has changed the game to a really large extent. You see both parties playing to this, that with a click, they can get people to not only donate once, but again and again and again. And those small dollar fundraising efforts, if you do them well, and if you have a large enough audience, can be extremely important. And those, of course, also build a base of support. People are literally investing in your campaign. So I think women will continue to become more prominent in the donor community as women make strides in other areas, be it CEOs, be it law firm partners, be it other issues of other positions of power in society. You will see them predominant as well. I will say that one of the things that truly hurt the women presidential candidates in 2020 was the rise of the self-funding billionaire. People like Tom Steyer, people like Michael Bloomberg could either sit out campaigns entirely or simply flood the zone in terms of ad money and do very well, in some cases knocking women off the stage, if you will. And those people felt like they could run. They didn't care if they didn't have any experience. They didn't care if this was the first time they're running for office in many instances, or if Michael Bloomberg had never run outside the city of New York. They're super confident they can go run for president. And so when you add in self-funders, that again is an advantage for men, because there are more men billionaires than there are women billionaires. So I think those people who are thinking about issues like campaign finance reform should really think about what sort of candidates the current rules tend to favor, and what sort of candidates women of color, men of color, women are at a disadvantage simply because they don't have those pre-existing networks of money already set up.
I have many more questions, and so does the audience, but we only have time for one more. So there's one that's quite apt for today, given the election in Germany. And that is, what was the secret behind Angela Merkel's success in Germany for so many years? Or Thatcher? Why don't Americans see this strength in women leaders?
Well, this is, sort of the big question. I think we are evolving in our politics. American politics is constantly being revisited, and both the composition of the parties and the ideological perspective of the parties are under constant revision. And it is a process. There were not prominent numbers of women in Congress really until 1992, if you can believe it. That was, a few decades ago. Before then, women were an absolute rarity. They are still only about 25% of the House. So we are on I think, a trajectory in the right direction, but it's going to take more years, more election cycles of women contributing, women volunteering, women running for office. We didn't elect a woman president this time. And when you look at other executive positions, governor, lieutenant governor, other statewide races, there's still relatively few women in those positions. So I think increasing the number of women in executive positions, increasing the participation of women is crucial. And I will add one other factor, and that is the way we cover our outlet, as well as other outlets, cover women needs, I think, a little bit more self-reflection. part of the book is how these women were covered. And I think almost unconsciously, there are certain tropes, certain kinds of language that are used when discussing women candidates. And it doesn't matter if the reporter is a man or a woman, there's a certain frame that we've all become accustomed to. The famous likability issue, which is not applied to a Bernie Sanders, who might be one of the least likable people on a personal level, but is applied to a woman. So I think the media is another area in which women have to press to be properly represented, both in terms of what gets covered, who gets covered, what kind of experts are brought in to contribute to the news. So I think we are headed in a positive direction. Certainly, we're in a much better place in terms of women in politics than we were a couple decades ago. But there is a long, long way to go. And I'll simply end with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's famous adage when asked, when will there be enough women on the court? And she said, when there are 9. So if you can follow that in every other office, then we'll know that women have truly arrived in politics.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, Julia, for having us. And thank you to all of you for your awesome questions.
Thank you. This was great.
And thanks from us at Politics and Prose, again, to Jennifer Rubin and Emma Brown. I reiterate, our audience out there, your thoughtful, engaging questions truly made this a magical hour. You can follow the links in the chat to get your copy of Resistance. We do have signed copies while they last for now. We can't host these types of events without the book sales to support them. So please go ahead, follow the link, or just visit us at politics-prose.com. While you're there, feel free to check out our events calendar for everything else coming up this fall. It's sure to be an exciting one. And from our shelves to yours, we hope everyone out there is staying safe, staying strong, and of course, staying well read. And we will see you next time. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks again, Jennifer and Emma.